At dawn, a maintenance worker unlocked a frozen service door beneath a Midtown parking ramp, breath fogging the air, noticing a stillness that felt wrong, the hum of traffic muted above, paperwork damp with meltwater nearby, and a calendar page stuck on December, its date circled, waiting in silence alone. If you like stories like this, make sure to subscribe and like the video. New York in 1985 carried winter the way a city carries memory, layered and heavy, salt-crusting curbs, steam rising from grates, radios murmuring weather and market reports as men folded newspapers in diners. The discovery traveled first through routine channels, logged as an unattended location check, then elevated as identifiers emerged and the quiet dread hardened into procedure. The woman was young, estimated early 20s, dressed for cold but not for what had happened, her belongings minimal, her life compressed into catalog numbers and photographs. There was no spectacle, only the disciplined order of evidence handling, gloves snapping, flash bulbs popping, notes taken with steady hands while the city continued above. She was later identified as 22 years old, a retail clerk who had moved into a shared apartment on the Upper East Side the previous summer, working extra shifts through Thanksgiving to afford gifts and a bus ticket home. Friends described her as punctual, reserved, and proud of independence. Her family lived upstate, accustomed to winter storms and long drives, and had last spoken with her the week before Christmas, planning a call on Christmas Eve. When she failed to arrive and failed to answer, a missing person flyer appeared on grocery boards and library cork walls, its black and white image fading under thumbtacks. The early investigation unfolded with the discipline common to that era: paper forms, carbon copies, and phone trees. Patrol officers canvassed the ramp and surrounding blocks, noting tire tracks dulled by snow, a receipt dated mid-December, and the calendar page that suggested a deliberate marker of time. The medical examiner's office recorded findings consistent with exposure and trauma without public detail, careful language chosen to avoid speculation. Time of death was estimated within a narrow window before the holidays, narrowing a city's worth of movement into a manageable slice. Detectives traced her last known movements through transit records and store logs, confirming a late shift and a subway ride that ended earlier than usual. Witness statements were collected patiently, each recollection weighed for consistency. A doorman recalled seeing her enter a building not her own, a detail that lingered without context. A cab dispatcher logged a fare refusal in bad weather, a minor note that would later matter. Nothing screamed. Everything whispered. Winter complicated the search. Snow erased footprints and holiday crowds diluted memory. News coverage remained restrained, a column inch here, a brief mention there, respectful and factual. For older readers, the tone matched the time, sober and civic, emphasizing cooperation and calm. Police held a short briefing, describing the victim and requesting information, then returned to their desks, fluorescent lights humming over stacks of folders. The autopsy suggested a sequence that pointed away from accident toward human agency, yet without drama. Investigators followed procedure, requesting lab work that would take weeks, then months. In 1985, forensic tools were advancing but limited, fingerprints requiring comparison by hand, serology offering groups rather than names. Still, diligence mattered. Fibers were bagged. Soil was compared. A ring imprint hinted at pressure applied, recorded and photographed. Christmas passed with the case unresolved. The city exhaled on New Year's Day, then resumed. Detectives re-interviewed coworkers, learning of a man who had lingered near closing time, polite, forgettable, his coat described vaguely. A neighbor mentioned a delivery van idling too long during a snow squall. None of it rose to probable cause. The case moved to the shelf labeled active but thin. Years followed the pattern familiar to cold cases. Leads dried, personnel rotated, the file thickened with memos and thin hopes. The victim's family held quiet remembrances, lighting candles each December, writing letters to precincts that were answered with care but little news. The city changed around the ramp, new paint, new signs, the old service door replaced, but the file remained. In the mid-90s, a review team reopened unsolved cases with fresh eyes. They digitized summaries and flagged evidence for re-examination as techniques improved. The calendar page returned to focus, not as a symbol but as a timeline anchor. Why December circled? Why that location? Analysts mapped her routine and noted a deviation that aligned with a temporary job assignment, a pop-up holiday store downtown, accessible by a different line. A surviving witness from that store remembered a regular customer who offered rides during storms, a small kindness remembered late. The name surfaced, common enough to evade early searches, but tied to a delivery business with access to garages. Records showed the business had a contract near the ramp. A photograph from a holiday party placed the man in a coat matching the vague description. The evidence was still circumstantial, but methodical accumulation tightened the net. Investigators sought corroboration through employment logs, vehicle maintenance records, and weather reports. Snowfall on the night in question explained delays and choices. A receipt placed the suspect's van in the area. A fingerprint lifted years earlier matched, finally, through an expanded database. The match was confirmed independently, the result logged, the chain of custody intact. An arrest followed decades later, quiet and procedural, no spectacle. The suspect, older now, complied, his story measured and incomplete. Prosecutors built the case carefully, aligning timelines, forensic findings, and witness recollections that had aged but not vanished. The courtroom atmosphere matched the evidence, restrained, respectful, focused. For the family, the resolution arrived like winter light, pale but real. The verdict acknowledged harm without theatrics. Sentencing followed statutory guidance, the judge nodding the years past and the persistence of truth. Afterward, the city moved on, as cities do, but a file closed properly, a calendar page no longer waiting. The renewed investigation unfolded without announcement, beginning in a cramped records room where decades of case files were stacked by borough and year. Clerks wheeled carts under buzzing lights, and detectives signed out folders with gloved hands to preserve brittle paper. The 1985 file showed careful work but limited tools, and reviewers marked margins with yellow tabs, not to correct the past, but to translate it into the present. Every note was reread, every photograph rescanned, every chain of custody verified so nothing would be lost to time or challenge. Analysts reconstructed the final week with calendar precision. Thanksgiving schedules explained retail staffing changes and late shifts. Payroll records placed the victim at a temporary downtown location for seasonal sales, altering her commute and exposing her to unfamiliar routes. Weather archives showed a fast-moving system on the night she disappeared, snow beginning as sleet, temperatures dropping, winds funneling between buildings. Such conditions narrowed choices and magnified small decisions, making offers of help seem reasonable. Transit data, once a wall, became a map. Archived turnstile counts indicated an exit consistent with a shorter walk during storms. A conductor's log recorded a delay near the end of the line, placing crowds on platforms longer than usual. Investigators layered these details to estimate a window measured in minutes rather than hours. The service ramp sat within that window, accessible to delivery vehicles authorized after business hours. The ramp itself was revisited, not physically but through diagrams and maintenance logs. Old contracts listed vendors permitted to enter during winter nights to salt and clear. Among them was a small delivery firm that serviced several Midtown garages. Employment rosters from the 80s were incomplete, but tax filings and insurance certificates survived on microfilm. A name appeared repeatedly, attached to routes that overlapped the victim's altered commute. Detectives pursued corroboration cautiously. They sought neutral confirmations before approaching witnesses, mindful of memory's fragility. A former dispatcher remembered a driver who volunteered for extra winter shifts, dependable and eager. A retired building engineer recalled a van idling longer than protocol allowed during a storm, noted in a logbook but never escalated. These fragments, independent and modest, aligned. The forensic review progressed in parallel. Evidence bags sealed decades earlier were opened under camera, fibers re-examined with modern microscopes, particulate compared to samples from the ramp stored by the city for maintenance reference. The results did not stand alone, but they harmonized with the emerging narrative. A partial fingerprint, once insufficient, now met database thresholds. Confirmation required redundancy, and a second lab verified the match without knowledge of the first. Prosecutors joined the process early, advising restraint and completeness. They requested a full evidentiary matrix showing how each fact supported another without speculation. Timelines were synchronized to payroll clocks, transit delays, and weather bulletins. The calendar page recovered at the scene was reinterpreted as a practical marker, a reminder of a shift or obligation rather than symbolism, consistent with the victim's habits. Media interest resurfaced gradually. Local papers ran measured updates emphasizing diligence and patience. For readers who remembered the 80s, the tone felt familiar, grounded in institutions rather than personalities. Police spokespeople avoided promises, repeating only what could be proven. Tips arrived, some helpful, many not, all logged and assessed. When detectives finally contacted the suspect, it was with preparation rather than urgency. He lived outside the city now, his business dissolved years earlier. Records placed his vehicle near Midtown on the relevant nights, supported by fuel receipts and service invoices. The interview was recorded, conducted according to standards refined over decades. His account acknowledged winter work and routes but faltered on specifics that documentation clarified. Arrest procedures followed quietly. There were no cameras, no statements beyond confirmation. The case moved to court with a file that showed continuity from 1985 to the present, gaps acknowledged, strengths emphasized. Defense motions challenged memory and delay, and prosecutors responded with documentation and method. Judges weighed arguments with the seriousness owed to time. Trial preparation centered on clarity. Experts explained old evidence in modern terms, avoiding overstated claims. Witnesses testified to routine observations rather than conclusions. The jury received timelines and maps, not narratives. Seasonal context mattered, not as mood but as logistics, explaining why choices narrowed and records aligned. As proceedings advanced, the victim's life was presented with restraint. Her age, work ethic, and plans were noted without embellishment. The holidays framed absence, explaining concern and search efforts, but the focus remained on verifiable steps. The city's rhythms served as backdrop, not character. The verdict arrived after deliberation that mirrored the investigation's pace. Guilt was found based on the convergence of evidence, each piece modest alone but compelling together. Sentencing followed statutory guidance, acknowledging gravity without rhetoric. Appeals were anticipated and addressed in advance through careful record-keeping. Afterward, files were archived again, this time with closure annotations. The family received notification through formal channels and private meetings. There were no public celebrations, only acknowledgments of completion. Each December thereafter, A notice appears in internal reports marking the case as resolved, a reminder that patience and procedure can outlast winter. The aftermath extended beyond the courtroom in ways that seldom reach print. Administrative reviews examine how the case moved through eras, identifying practices that preserved integrity and those that required change. Training bulletins cited the investigation as an example of continuity, emphasizing that early discipline makes later science useful. Budget lines were adjusted to maintain cold storage and digitization, small investments justified by quiet success. For officers nearing retirement, the resolution carried a professional satisfaction rooted in craft. They spoke privately of notebooks kept and habits formed, of winter nights spent canvassing without result, of trust in systems that reward patience. Younger detectives absorbed the lesson that absence of noise does not equal absence of progress. The city, indifferent yet dependent, benefited from such institutional memory. Community response was subdued. Letters to editors thanked investigators without nomming them. A brief mention appeared in a year-end review of public safety, tucked between statistics and policy notes. The ramp where the discovery occurred had long since been renovated, its history invisible to commuters who passed above, unaware of the records beneath their feet. The legal outcome closed one path while opening others. Civil filings addressed employment oversight and access protocols, resolved through compliance rather than litigation. Businesses revised winter procedures, clarifying authorization and logging. None of these measures claimed causation. They acknowledged responsibility to minimize risk. Such changes rarely make headlines but accumulate into safer routines. Technically, the case advanced standards for evidence longevity. Archivists documented how packaging and labeling from the 80s preserved material sufficiently for modern analysis. A white paper circulated among laboratories, recommending similar practices. The fingerprint database expansion, often criticized abstractly, found a concrete justification here, tied to accountability and due process. For the family, closure manifested in ordinary acts. A headstone inscription was updated to include a date once uncertain. Photographs returned to albums. Holiday gatherings resumed a shape that had been disrupted, still marked by absence but no longer by questions. They declined interviews, preferring privacy over narrative. The city's seasonal cycle continued. Thanksgiving parades passed through routes once canvassed. Christmas lights reflected on wet pavement near the courthouse. New Year's mornings brought quiet streets and open files for other cases. The resolved investigation became a reference point, not a monument, its value measured by procedure rather than emotion. In the end, the story rests on alignment. Weather and work schedules, transit and maintenance logs, fibers and fingerprints, memory and documentation, all converged without embellishment. The discipline of waiting allowed truth to surface when tools caught up. The city did not change because of the case. It functioned as intended. And in that functioning, a young woman's name moved from a flyer to a record marked complete, a winter chapter closed with care. Documentation of the case now sits in climate-controlled storage, its digital twin backed up redundantly and audited annually. References to it remain measured, focused on sequence and verification. No myths attach when records speak plainly. Winter will return as it always does, with routines that keep order amid cold. In those routines lies assurance that effort persists beyond headlines, that calendars turn, and that patience, properly applied, eventually finds answers. This assurance matters most to those who read files late in careers, recognizing patterns and limits. It matters to families who wait without spectacle. It matters to institutions tasked with memory. The case offers no drama, only a demonstration that method endures. That endurance, repeated across seasons, is the city's quiet promise to itself. Here, the promise held. A winter from another decade released its hold through work that respected law and fact. The file rests. The process continues. Others will follow, and the city will keep turning pages with care. That is the measure, quiet and sufficient, written in margins and minutes and carried forward without ceremony. It stands complete within record and routine, for those who look and remember. In the months following sentencing, the case entered a quieter phase defined by paperwork rather than headlines. Appeals were filed as expected, grounded in procedural arguments about delay and recollection. Appellate courts reviewed transcripts with the same restraint that had characterized the investigation, focusing on whether standards were met rather than emotions stirred. The rulings affirmed the conviction, noting that evidence had been preserved, tested, and presented within the law, and that time alone did not erode truth when records remained intact. Attention then turned to the administrative lessons drawn from the file. Supervisors convened reviews to understand how a case could sleep for years without being forgotten. They documented the value of meticulous logging, the importance of resisting premature conclusions, and the benefit of preserving even modest fragments. Training materials emphasize that patience is not passivity, that winter conditions and holiday routines complicate timelines, and that careful mapping can turn noise into signal. For the city's older residents, the resolution resonated differently. Many remembered the 80s as a period of grit and routine, when newspapers arrived thick with listings and radios delivered steady voices. The case fit that memory, not as a dramatic exception, but as an example of how institutions function when allowed to work steadily. Letters arrived at precincts from retirees who thanked unnamed officers for seeing the job through, their tone measured and civic. The victim's neighborhood marked the passing years with small changes. Shops turned over, signage updated, sidewalks repaired. A library branch replaced its cork board with a digital screen, erasing the physical space where flyers once hung. Yet the memory persisted in private ways. Neighbors who had noticed the original postings remembered the face and the season, connecting cold mornings with unanswered questions now resolved. Documentation related to the case became a reference point for archivists. They cataloged how analog materials transitioned into digital formats without losing context. Marginal notes were scanned with care to preserve intent. Photographs were indexed by location and angle, ensuring that future reviewers could reconstruct scenes without imagination. Such practices, mundane and precise, were highlighted as safeguards against both loss and distortion. The legal aftermath included compliance reviews for businesses that accessed city facilities during winter months. Contracts were updated to clarify authorization windows and logging requirements. These changes were not punitive but preventive, acknowledging that routine access carries responsibility. The measures passed quietly through committees and into effect, altering daily operations in ways few noticed. Within the department, the case influenced staffing of cold case units. Administrators recognized that continuity matters, that long arcs benefit from stable oversight. They allocated resources to maintain expertise rather than chase novelty. Metrics shifted subtly, valuing completeness alongside clearance rates. The adjustment reflected an understanding that some answers mature over decades, not quarters. Public memory of the case remained subdued. There were no documentaries released immediately, no anniversaries marked with ceremony. When mentioned, it appeared in compilations of resolved cases, a paragraph among many. This restraint aligned with the family's wishes and with the city's preference for function over flourish. Closure was treated as an outcome, not an event. Seasonal rhythms continued to frame the story in retrospect. Thanksgiving marked the beginning of the timeline, Christmas its turning point, New Year its quiet pause. These dates mattered because they shaped behavior and records, not because they invited sentiment. Analysts noted how holidays compress schedules and alter routes, lessons applicable beyond this file. The courthouse where the verdict was delivered returned to routine quickly. Calendars filled with other matters, clerks filed judgments, and security resumed familiar patterns. The case left no plaque, only entries in ledgers and databases. Its presence was felt in procedures refined and habits reinforced. For investigators who had carried the file across years, the resolution prompted reflection without nostalgia. They spoke of trust in systems and respect for evidence, of resisting shortcuts even when pressure mounted. Their accounts emphasized teamwork across generations, acknowledging predecessors whose careful work enabled later breakthroughs. Such continuity was presented as the true achievement. The family's interactions with the system concluded with formal notifications and the return of personal effects. These exchanges were handled with care, guided by protocols designed to minimize intrusion. Grief counselors offered support, and the family accepted selectively, preferring privacy. Their statements, brief and composed, thanked those involved and requested space. Academic interest in the case emerged in limited form. Criminal justice programs referenced it when discussing cold case methodology, highlighting how incremental improvements accumulate. Students examined timelines and evidence matrices, learning how to avoid confirmation bias and how to document uncertainty. The case served as a teaching tool precisely because it lacked spectacle. The broader city context underscored the investigation's character. New York's scale demands systems that can absorb delay without abandoning responsibility. The case illustrated that capacity, showing how files persist amid change. Streets were repaved, transit lines extended, administrations shifted, yet records remained accessible and meaningful. Media retrospectives, when they appeared, focused on process rather than personality. Reporters interviewed archivists and analysts, asking about preservation and review cycles. Such coverage reinforced public understanding that resolution often depends on infrastructure, not inspiration. It also affirmed that accountability can coexist with patience. As years passed, the case settled into institutional memory. Annual audits confirmed that evidence storage met standards. Digital backups were tested and refreshed. Notes were added to training manuals. These actions ensured that the case's lessons endured beyond individual careers. The victim's name appeared in a registry of resolved cases maintained by the state. The entry was factual, listing dates and outcomes. It stood among many, equal in format, reinforcing the principle that justice records treat each life with the same seriousness. Families consulted the registry for confirmation, finding reassurance in completion. Winter returned again and again. Snow fell on the city, altering routines and narrowing choices. Each season echoed the conditions that once complicated the investigation, reminding professionals why preparation matters. Salt trucks rolled, logs were kept, and access was monitored. These ordinary acts reflected institutional learning applied quietly. In the end, the case's significance lay in its ordinariness. It demonstrated how careful documentation, preserved through time, can bridge eras. It showed that restraint in language and action supports credibility. It affirmed that closure need not be loud to be real. For those who encounter the file now, the experience is measured. They read reports, examine photographs, and follow timelines without inference. They see how questions were asked and answered. They note where uncertainty remained and how it was bounded. This transparency invites trust. The city continues to produce cases, each with its own complexity. Some will resolve quickly, others slowly. The infrastructure built and maintained will support both. The resolved case from 1985 occupies its place within that continuum, neither elevated nor forgotten. As holidays approach each year, institutions adjust schedules and staffing. Analysts recall how such periods shape data. They plan accordingly, ensuring coverage and documentation. These practices, refined over time, are part of the legacy of cases like this one. Ultimately, the narrative concludes without flourish. A young woman's life, once reduced to flyers and files, was acknowledged through lawful process. The responsible party was identified and held accountable. The system functioned across decades, guided by procedure. The city moved on, carrying the lesson forward. This resolution does not promise perfection, only persistence. It suggests that patience, paired with method, can yield answers even when years intervene. It honors work done quietly and well, and it leaves the record complete, ready to rest within the archives, available if needed but finished in purpose. The final stage of the case settled into permanence through records rather than remembrance. Once appellate options were exhausted and the sentence affirmed, the file received its closing designation, a status that carried administrative weight. Evidence was re-inventoried, seals checked, and storage conditions logged. Digital records were mirrored and audited, ensuring that the path from discovery to conviction remained traceable. Closure here meant readiness, the ability to answer questions with documentation rather than recollection. Institutionally, the case informed policy in subtle ways. Supervisors adjusted review cycles for unresolved investigations, scheduling periodic reassessments tied to advancements in forensic capability. These cycles were designed to be quiet and consistent, independent of media interest. The approach reflected a belief that progress emerges from structure, not urgency. Budgets accounted for preservation, recognizing that time can be an ally when care is taken early. The city's relationship to the case remained understated. There were no memorials erected at the site, no plaques to fix a moment in place. The ramp functioned as intended, serving daily traffic without interruption. Commuters passed through unaware of the history beneath their tires. This anonymity aligned with the case's tone, a preference for resolution over recognition. For those who study criminal justice late in their careers, the file offered a measured example. It illustrated how seasonal patterns influence behavior and records, how holidays compress schedules and alter choices, and how weather becomes a variable rather than a backdrop. It showed the importance of maintaining logs that seem mundane at the time but become decisive later. These lessons were practical, transferable, and devoid of myth. The victim's family marked the resolution privately. Legal closure allowed administrative tasks long deferred to be completed. Documents were updated, uncertainties resolved. Family gatherings resumed their customary rhythms, still marked by absence but freed from speculation. They chose not to participate in public narratives, trusting the record to speak sufficiently. Within law enforcement, the case reinforced the ethic of continuity. Officers who had not been born when the investigation began could now read its entirety, understanding how each generation contributed without knowing the outcome. The continuity validated routine diligence, affirming that careful work accumulates value beyond individual tenure. Media accounts, sparse and factual, framed the resolution as a function of persistence. They highlighted the role of preserved evidence and methodical review rather than dramatic breakthroughs. Such framing contributed to public trust, aligning expectations with reality. The story resisted simplification, honoring complexity without obscuring accountability. Academically, the case entered curricula as a study in longevity. Students analyzed how analog constraints shaped early decisions and how later technologies complemented rather than replaced those foundations. They learned to respect limitations without surrendering to them. The case underscored that science advances, but integrity endures. Seasonal references remained relevant in analysis. Thanksgiving schedules explained staffing anomalies. Christmas Eve weather reports clarified transit deviations. New Year's logs accounted for staffing changes. These details were not sentimental, they were operational. Understanding them required familiarity with how cities function during holidays, a knowledge often overlooked. The legal system's response emphasized balance. Courts acknowledged the passage of time while affirming that rights and responsibilities persist. Opinions articulated standards clearly, providing guidance for future cases. The reasoning avoided rhetoric, focusing instead on whether procedures were followed and evidence remained reliable. The broader civic impact was modest but meaningful. City agencies coordinated to improve data retention and access, recognizing that interdepartmental records often intersect in investigations. These improvements benefited multiple functions, from maintenance to public safety. The changes were incremental, consistent with the case's character. For investigators, the resolution offered a professional satisfaction rooted in craft. They noted how restraint protected credibility, how avoiding speculation preserved options, and how patience allowed tools to mature. Their reflections informed mentorship, shaping how experience was passed forward. The passage of time softened public memory but sharpened institutional clarity. The case's documentation remained intact, accessible, and instructive. It did not rely on narrative embellishment to retain relevance. Its value lay in completeness. As winters continued to cycle through the city, the conditions that once complicated the investigation became reminders of why preparation matters. Snowstorms still narrowed choices. Holidays still altered routines. Logs were still kept. Each repetition affirmed that learning had been absorbed. Ultimately, the case concluded as it began, with quiet attention to detail. A discovery made in winter led to years of work that respected law and fact. The responsible individual was identified through lawful means, evidence aligned, and accountability achieved. The aftermath unfolded without spectacle, integrated into the city's routines. The record now rests among others, equal in format and seriousness. It stands as a testament to the idea that justice is often procedural rather than dramatic. The city's promise was not to prevent every harm, but to pursue answers with integrity. In this instance, that promise was kept. No single moment defines the resolution. It is defined instead by accumulation, by pages added carefully, by evidence preserved, by reviews conducted on schedule. These actions, repeated across years, produced an outcome that could withstand scrutiny. For those who read the file today, the experience is instructive. It demonstrates how to build a case that survives time, how to honor a victim without exaggeration, and how to conclude with certainty rather than noise. The finality is administrative, legal, and human. The city continues its work, carrying forward systems refined by experience. Other cases await attention, each with its own winter and waiting. The resolved investigation from 1985 contributes to that continuum, a completed chapter that informs the next. In this way, closure becomes a function rather than an event. It is marked by checks completed, seals verified, and entries finalized. It leaves space for life to proceed without unanswered questions. The narrative ends not with a flourish but with confirmation. The file is closed. The outcome stands. The process endures.